A Chardon sipper from a rosé, nigga, huh? Brook non, sippin' on.
Cristal forever. Play the crib when it's mink weather. The mafia keep cannons in they Mark Buchanans. Usually quattro cinco, the shell sink slow, tossing ya. Mad slugs through your Nautica. I'm warning ya.
Jay-Z and Biggie Smalls, nigga, shit you draw. Where you from? Brooklyn, going out to all. Flatbush.
Plan about being close to this community and doing research with members in this community, I was compelled to become more involved. And there just came a time where this artificial line that I was drawing became too great to ignore, and I just needed to step into it. You needed to step across it, or erase it actually, and make my work much more improvisational, and the improvisational means going with the flow of the community in which I was with. And some of that being in the moment, I think really contributed a lot of insight to just understanding some of these processes that I was seeing, being there and living in the moment. So I just want to share that little bit. But moving on to probably what Joe was just saying, there's a notion of how are we insiders and how are we outsiders within the communities that we do work. And actually, I had originally thought of this question as within the communities in which we work, but I think it's also really important to think about within the academic world as well. So we're here straddling these two lines, and any of you can feel free to speak about that as much as you want, but I think focusing on the academic world and the insider and outsiderness in the academic world is just as important.
I can take a stab at it. I mean, I definitely had a situation which I mentioned in Foundation that would seem strange to me, but at the same time didn't really. It seemed like it would seem strange to somebody else. It didn't seem strange to me, which is that I was teaching at Tufts, which is outside of Boston in Medford, during most of the time that I was doing the research for this book, but I was living in Brooklyn, and that had nothing to do with my research. That just happened to do with me being a New York person who refused to move to Boston for reasons that should be obvious to anybody that's from New York. Excuse me. So, I mean, but my research site was basically in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, the areas around there. So basically every week, I mean, my house was there, my friends were there, my social scene. I lived in the field, and then every week I would make this journey to the academic world, which not just physically but culturally, I absolutely felt more comfortable in Brooklyn than I did, in an elite private college institution. Although I felt comfortable there too, but I definitely felt like more of an outsider to the academic world at that moment, or to that particular academic scene, than I did in my field site. And so it really opened up a lot of questions for me about where does exactly the questions that you're asking, like why is there an assumption where, of course, anybody that does ethnography is straddling these different worlds. Why is there this presumption that we really belong in the academic world and we're kind of moving outside of where we're supposed to be? And just one really basic example of that is like the clothes that I wore when I was doing field work were what I normally wear, but I had to like wear special clothes to go into the academic world. So, you know what I mean? Just something as basic as that is like, I'm really much more me when I'm in the field situation, so why am I pretending, or why am I putting on this weird shell of and it has to do with all kinds of things, particularly of authority. It has to do with, I think there's issues of ethnicity there, or presumptions about the way people address issues of ethnicity and class and all these different issues. So that was a big thing for me. The other thing for me was in that second book, it really made me realize how many different axes of insiderness and outsiderness we're all subject to, including people that aren't doing ethnography, including people that are just part of the community or that are viewed as part of the community. Everybody is an insider in some ways and an outsider in other ways. So, I mean, to compare me to any random person in the community, it's like, well, I might be more of an insider in terms of gender than that person is, but they might be more of an insider in terms of where they grew up, you know what I mean? And so, like, who's to say which is more? One of the things that really came across to me, particularly in dealing with a lot of hip-hop veterans, was my age. Like, I happen to be the same age as a lot of the really important, early hip-hop people, which was a huge deal. I hadn't really anticipated that, but I was really able to connect with people on the grounds of us mutually being in our late 30s and early 40s in a way, and I definitely got sort of the response that was something that we shared, that these younger kids, who somebody looking at it from far away might say, obviously they have much more in common with those kids, and in certain ways, of course, they do, but there were these other levels that we could make connections on. And I think thinking about the nature of the way people make connections, or more than thinking about it, experiencing it, just opens up possibilities for what you can explore. And just to kind of tie that off, I want to try not to talk for too long, but that, to me, that's the real value of ethnography and performance in this situation, which is you as an individual can only come up with so many ideas, and there are a lot of things that just would never occur to you just because they would never occur to you. And but it's the interaction with people that points out the things that you don't know, and theoretically that's what you should be most interested in. That's why I got into this business in the first place, is to find out things that I didn't know. If I'm just going to sit in my room and say things to the mirror that I already know, it's totally pointless. The whole point is to put myself in uncomfortable situations and have people confront me with my blind spots. So I think it's important to actively engage that and to be open to it, and because that's how you grow.
Well, two things come to mind, I think, on the inside or outside thing, and I think this really does go back to coming into academia as having the journalism first, is I've never been comfortable self-identifying myself or claiming to be an insider, because you would never really do that as a journalist, because it would then challenge your objectivity, right?
Yeah.
So, which is not to say that I sort of think of myself as an outsider either, because then that seems a little colonialistic to me, to sort of explore other things. I think that the main thing is I just want to maintain some kind of objective critical distance, which doesn't mean that I don't care about the people or the phenomenon that I'm looking at, but it's also that I don't confuse myself as being a part of it if I'm in sort of a research mode. But that's sort of the second point, which is I think for me, just as an individual personality type, I tend to very much compartmentalize the things that I do. So if I'm doing scholarship, that's the sort of, I'm in scholarly mode, which is different from journalism mode, which is different from what I do as a DJ or all these other things. And as my mentors have pointed out to me, these are probably false divides that I sort of create in my own head because it makes me more comfortable with how I sort of switch these roles, even though they're not necessarily actually huge switches in roles. They all contain elements of one another. But I think to establish that comfort level and to feel like I'm still maintaining sort of that objective distance, and that I'm being responsible to sort of, what I think Joe highlights, a lot of the ethical and sort of moral, responsibilities that we have, that sort of helps. The second part of your question is the outsiderness within academia, and I think, one of the things that strikes me, and I don't know how the rest of the panel or people out here feel, I mean, hip-hop scholarship has been going on for at least 20 years. I mean, Trisha Rose wrote Black Noise in, 91, 92, and that was based on research. Okay, it was really based on research she was doing, in the late 80s, early 90s. And there were books before hers as well. But, I still feel like when I talk about my work with a non-hip-hop scholar, audience of scholars, I sort of get that, oh, that's really cool, or that's really cute, and it's sort of this sort of patronizing, or, oh, I didn't realize you could do that. I didn't realize you could study hip-hop. Which, I mean, I might have been a little bit more sympathetic to 20 years ago, but in 2012, it just really strikes me as how marginal this work is, even though hip-hop has become the kind of resonant, powerful, and arguably most important form of youth culture of the last quarter century. But, as we all know, academia moves a little bit slow, and for it to reach the stature of how perhaps rock music is now kind of embraced within the canon of scholarship, in a more naturalistic way. And I could be wrong about that as well, but I just think, this probably going to take another 20, 30 years somehow. And so that is sort of an area of frustration. I know I've had conversations with other people about that as well, is that our colleagues, well-meaning as they are, don't really get what it is we do or why it's important. And to me, it just seems self-evident, like it's fucking hip-hop,
And I would say even the supportiveness that you get is the kind of, that's cool.
Mm-hmm.
It's this supportiveness that doesn't understand the depth.
Right. I mean, because that's cool ultimately means I don't know what it is that you do. I don't really claim to understand it, but I don't want to be insulting to you by saying that. That's really what that's cool means.
Well,
I think part of it too is you have to talk about it in a way that makes that clear. One of the things that I started to do when people ask me, like, what I've been working on recently is I studied this form of traditional Aphrodite or competitive dance that started in the Bronx. And people say, oh, that's very interesting. I can't believe I've never heard of such a thing. And I said, well, it's called b-boying. You probably heard it referred to as breakdancing. And I'm like, what? Like, they can't do that. That is what it is. Right. That's absolutely what it is. But they're predisposed to put it in this particular box. So that's part of it to me too, is to kind of. But I just wanted to
I'm going to use it. I'm going to use that for Aphrodite or competitive dance.
Traditional Aphrodite sport. That's an important thing to me too, because it is traditional. People have a very strong commitment to it as a tradition, to maintaining a tradition, to mentorship, and that's true for, as we know, for many aspects of hip hop. People, and that also is one of the reasons I think why people treat it superficially, at least partially it's because they're focusing on the pop music aspect of hip hop, which may or may not have that in it. A lot of people haven't dealt with the traditional aspects of hip hop because it's difficult to study unless you're studying it ethnographically, because you have to actually engage with the way the tradition is preserved. So, I mean, that's something that's definitely been understudied, in my opinion, obviously. But I think the more that we can project that, and again, it doesn't have, I don't want to get into a thing of like, oh, the authentic hip hop versus the pop hip hop. The pop music aspect of hip hop is absolutely as authentic and as legitimate as any other aspect. It's just that it's authentic and legitimate as pop music. And to me, I don't understand why that's an issue. It's like, this is an apple, this is an orange. I'm not mad at an apple for not being an orange. They're just two different things. I just wanted to say one other thing about that in terms of the insider and outsider and the personal aspect of it. One of the things that's, I think, often viewed as a negative aspect of doing ethnography, but I find to be very powerful if you can harness it properly, is the extent to which your own personal insecurities and neuroses can drive you to do certain things and not do other things. So two ways that, for me, that's come into play in hip-hop is, I got into hip-hop in the late, like I said, mid-late 80s, when, as I later came to see it, hip-hop happened to be going through a particularly black nationalist phase. At the time, I thought it had always been that way, and I later learned it hadn't, that was a response to hip-hop's expanding beyond its boundaries, or whatever. So that was just part of, as a white person, if you were going to engage in hip-hop, that was just something that you had to deal with. Like, what does it mean to be a white person involved in this music? You expect people to call you on things, and you just had to work through that. And I often say, if I had gotten into hip hop more recently, I would feel like more of an insider. And I'm not joking about that. I really feel like I've internalized a lot of ideas about sort of the way hip hop was framed from the time that I happened to get into it, and I carry those with me to this day. I personally think that's very healthy, because I never become too self-assured in the way that I deal with a lot of these issues. So I think that's important. The other thing is, and this might be opening up a can of worms, this might be also one of those moments where you kind of reveal something about yourself thinking that everybody has it in common, and then it turns out you're the only person. So, but what the hell, I'll do it. That's what EMP is all about, which is that ethnography is a good social excuse for things, I found too. Like, I can be in a situation where, like, ordinarily I'd just be this nerdy guy standing against the wall, feeling really uncomfortable at this club at 2 o'clock in the morning. But really, I'm doing ethnography. And so, I mean, that is helpful on a number of levels. I just wanted to put that out there.
Ali, I don't want to frame what you're going to say in any way, but just to make me comment that you're someone who has spent periods of time in, I guess, what you would call the field, and periods of time away from academia. Even though as I'm saying this, I realize too that with technology these days you're kind of in both. But your ideas about insider.
Well,
anything that's going on now.
My synapses are firing. I'm just so excited to be here, just talking with you guys and with the people who are here. It's just awesome. But so I have too much to say. I mean, we're talking about de-essentializing hip-hop discourses, right? I mean, that's what we're all doing. That is the point of doing ethnography, and that's what drove us to write what we write, or to do what we do, or to be involved in music the way we are, right? We're de-essentializing, and the only way to de-essentialize a discourse or a genre or a complex of understandings about something, or a cultural binary or an imperialist model for understanding life and culture, is to de-essentialize the self. And that, I mean, that's what I think ethnography brings to the table. That's what I'm hearing from you all, right? I mean, Joe's talking about axes of insiderness and outsiderness, and we're all, it has to be specific for us. We all have these different kinds of situations in which the axes are different. In academia, my axes of outsiderness, a lot of that has to do with class, right? Because I grew up working class, and my parents don't have college degrees, and this is like, what am I doing in academia? That's my outsiderness, right? My insiderness is like, I'm smart and I've been in school for a long time, and I have the privilege of a good education. So in a sense, I belong there. In the field of Mississippi, in the Mississippi Delta, where I actually lived for 2 years, and then spent big chunks of time, between 3 and 6 months a year, returned like every other weekend while I was in school, in graduate school. It was over the course of 5 years. There was a very different access, one that seems quite clear, the racial binary between black and white, right? And it's quite easy for me to say, well, by the time everybody figured out that I wasn't cool with the politics of the white community, then I was in with the black community. It's not that simple. There were multiple axes. Class was a part of that. My understanding of hip-hop was another part of that. Humility was another part of that. Gender was another part of that. And I got taught how to perform myself, not just in the entire community of Mississippi accepted me as someone who was cool with the black community, but I was accepted in one way by Kenyatta Deer, who was a 16-year-old woman artist. I was accepted in another way and drawn different boundaries, right, by Miss Martha Raybone, who was the choir director at the church. And with Top Notch the Villain, who was my very close consultant, I was given a different kind of boundaries and different kinds of axes. These axes aren't up to me, and they're not clear, and they're not binary. So it's very, to be an ethnographer is to always be uncomfortable, right? To always be in that generative space where we feel those axes of difference, how they emerge and what those textures are, and to pay attention not to how we control those axes, but how our consultants actually interpolate us into their lives, into their field, how they invite us, how they assert their own force upon our identities, right? Top Notch decided I was a sister to him, so we have a very close, familiar relationship. For Miss Martha Raven, I was a student. She was a choir director, and I was a student, and she taught me a lot about her oral histories of the Mississippi Delta. So, and then in Senegal, I went to Senegal, and I said, okay, this is going to be interesting. This is a post-colonial space. I'll either be interpolated as, one of the European expats who hang out in the hip-hop scene here, or something else. And I got there, and before long, I was kind of learning drums and, being in the community. I was learning Wolof, which I'm much better at than French, because it's French. But I was learning well before I knew it, and I was living in a neighborhood called Gadjouai that doesn't have a lot of Europeans. It very, very rarely sees those hipsters or expats coming into the community. Next thing you know, everybody in Dakar was calling me a Gelul. They were saying that I was a musician, and I was interpolated in a whole different identity, which was that of a musician, of a praise singer, of a person who needed to learn traditions of eloquence, and maybe someone who didn't have the kind of education, for instance, that would lead me to be a university person. So they expected me to dance, to sing, to play drums, and to perform, rather than to be an academic. So that was really interesting. So I feel like I'm different from situation to situation. I feel like I'm in the right temperature of water here because y'all are in the same situation as I am. So that sense of discomfort, that sense of contingency is extremely generative, not only for ethnography, but for hip-hop studies. If we continue to rethink ourselves as people and rethink ourselves in conversation with other people, all of a sudden we notice that those other people matter a lot. It's not who I say I am. It's who they tell me to be, and then how I push back in conversation with that.
I just wanted to, if you have a book, you should always carry it on your person at all times. This is my advice to you. You never know when it's going to come in handy. So I just wanted to read something from my first book. I was asking Prince Paul about this issue, like your duck from Robin Kelly, and I actually quote in here, about this sort of narrative of that hip-hop as a response to oppression, which, I mean, I'm not saying that it's not that, but I'm saying it's not that simple, because if you say it that way, like I often say, it's like, the way a lot of people talk about hip-hop is like if you just grab 10 random people off the street in the South Bronx in 1975 and just kept oppressing them for like 10 years, eventually they'd walk out with like, it takes a nation of millions to hold us back or something. Like, there's a certain amount of initiative and creativity and thought and, you know, metacognitive ability, artistic intention that goes into this, and it's really insulting to not give people that credit. That doesn't mean that there's not a politics to it. Clearly there is, but the politics is embedded in the art. It's not just the existence of the art that has the political implication. So I was asking Prince Paul about this, and specifically, this was in the context of sampling, about this story that like people came up with sampling because they didn't have access to instruments. So it's a reaction to the poverty of the educational system. And first of all, the one point that everybody I talked to made was samplers are expensive. They were really expensive then. Like, that argument just doesn't make any sense to anybody in the hip-hop community. And so what that says is the person making the argument has never interacted with anybody in the hip-hop community. Because you're not going to say, oh yeah, they couldn't afford a guitar, so they went out and bought a $3,000 argument. Just doesn't make any sense. So again, you want to engage. But so I asked him about this, and he said, this is his quote, you know, everybody went to school that had a band. You could take an instrument if you wanted to, courtesy of your public school system if you wanted to. But man, you playing the clarinet isn't going to be like, bam, ka, boom, boom, ka. Everybody in the party, oh, it wasn't that. No, with echo chambers. He wasn't going to get that with a clarinet. I mean, yeah, it evolved from whatever the culture is, but that's just an adaptation of whatever else was going at the time. It wasn't cats sitting around like, man, times are hard, man. Can of beans up in the refrigerator. Man, I gotta do some hip hop. I gotta get It wasn't like that, man. That's Cool Herc. He was the first guy out there. I know him too. We talked plenty of times. He's a good guy. He's not gonna sit there and be like, man, and his whole body is just like, man, it was just so hard for me, man. I just felt like I needed to just play beats back to back. I just had to feel good. These times was just so hard. Yeah, cats kill me with that. So, like, that was really eye-opening for me on a number of levels. And I just want to say that to reinforce what I was saying.
If I could just real quick add too, I think part of the thing with why, for me at least, pleasure hadn't really entered into a lot of the ways I think about music and culture and scholarship as well, is that at a certain part early, I think pleasure was really seen as being superficial and insignificant. To talk about that, you were not being properly political or properly serious as a scholar. And I really have to acknowledge, I think that part of this has changed is largely through the intervention of feminist critical gender studies and sexuality studies. I think has completely, well, maybe not throughout all of academia, because those, I think, more conservative still exist, but I think they really opened up a space in which you can talk about pleasure in a way that is important, is significant, is not superficial, and is political in itself, right? Pleasure is political because of the force that it brings. And I think that we can certainly apply those kinds of ideas. And I think that can apply to the analyses of hip-hop. People who do good hip-hop scholarship have been able to talk about the pleasure principle, not as a side thing, but as the sort of the thing itself, if you will. Right?
You know, can I just respond to that? And also something Ali was saying. I think another way that feminist theory is really important, it hasn't come into play so much in hip-hop scholarship yet, but I hope it will, in terms of the way things are framed, in terms of what kind of work is significant and what kind of work isn't. People always talk about women in hip-hop, and they talk about like, oh, there aren't more women MCs, blah, blah, blah. Women are all over hip-hop. People just ignore it because they automatically exclude the things that women do as not being significant. Almost every hip-hop event I've ever been to has been organized by women. Almost every hip-hop publicist is a woman.
That's right.
You know, all these different aspects that would make it impossible for hip-hop to happen are done by women. It's not that it's not there, it's that the people are looking at certain things as being important and other things as not being important. And we need to understand the circularity of that, how that reproduces a certain way of looking at significance. And I think, for me at least, that's one area where feminists